Hello, I'm Katherine G. McRae, and you're watching Perspective. My guest today is Antoinette Blunt with Ironside Consulting. Welcome, Antoinette.
Thank you, Katherine.
Antoinette, you have a whole whack of initials after your name. I know you have a ton of experience. Maybe you could just tell our viewing audience what all those initials stand for.
Thank you. I do have a master's degree in public administration. In addition to that, I have 3 levels of designation in the Human Resources Professional Associations of Ontario. So I'm a certified human resource professional. I have a designation that places me at the executive level as well. In addition to that, I was awarded with a fellow designation by the Professional Association in Ontario.
Wow.
Thank you.
So you've got a lot of experience, and one of your specialties that you deal with, and I know you have a whole wide range of work specialties that you deal with. One that you want to talk about today is workplace bullying and harassment.
Correct. I mean, that certainly is an area that I have provided advice and training to a number of employers with. That is really in relation to legislative requirements in Ontario that require employers to ensure that they have policies and procedures in place with respect to bullying and harassment and violence prevention in the workplace.
So at what point are you coming into the workplace? Are you helping them set up those policies to begin with, or coming to their workplace to see that those policies are being effective?
When the policies first came out, I did help a lot of clients to develop policies. So I've done that. In addition to that, I've also provided training to places of employment for employees, for managers, supervisors, in how to identify potential risks in the workplace and also acquaint them with some of the recent legislative changes. Over the past probably 5 years or so, I've also provided services for investigation where there have been allegations of bullying and harassment or violence in the workplace. So in addition to being a certified human resources professional, I'm also a licensed private investigator in Ontario, and my company is licensed as well. So if a workplace has an allegation or complaint of violation of this act, any allegations of bullying or harassment or violence, that's a service I can provide to them. Certainly organizations, absolutely under the legislation, have the right to initiate their own investigations. In fact, they have a responsibility to do so. But
are they all aware that it is their responsibility?
I'm sure they are. That was one of the requirements that provided more enforcement under the legislation. In September of 2016, one of the bills that was passed was called Bill 132. It amended a number of pieces of legislation, one of them being the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario. And under that bill, one of the changes indicated to employers that if you do not investigate where there has been an allegation and the Ministry of Labour is contacted by an employee, they have the right to enforce and send in an investigator at the cost to the employer. So it does give employees another option if they're simply not being listened to, which I have to say is not what I have found. Most employers are very proactive.
But we have seen that in high-profile cases too, on the news, where the employer maybe didn't take action when they should have.
That's correct. And in 2016, one of the other major changes to the Occupational Health and Safety Act was that they have added in a definition of workplace sexual harassment. So in addition to bullying and harassment, they have clarified that under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, a responsibility for the employer is to ensure that the workplace is free from workplace sexual harassment as well.
Right, okay. We need to go to break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. You're watching Perspective, and we're talking today about workplace harassment and bullying. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Katherine G. McRae, and this is Perspective with my guest, Antoinette Blunt from Ironside Consulting. We're talking about workplace harassment, bullying, and even sexual harassment in the workplace. What is the rights of the employer versus the rights of the employee when it comes to workplace harassment and sexual harassment specifically?
Well, first of all, for employers, it's really a level of responsibility. The Occupational Health and Safety Act has many components to it, but when it comes to workplace bullying, harassment, and sexual harassment, the employer is responsible to ensure that the workplace is safe, that the workplace is free from any bullying and harassment, and they're also responsible to ensure that they have a policy and procedure in place, that they train all their employees on what is acceptable and what the legal requirements are for compliance, that they dedicate resources for training of their employees so that they understand how they're expected to behave in the workplace. So those are some of the responsibilities of employers.
And what is the responsibility then of the employee?
Well, every employee is responsible to ensure that they understand how to communicate and relate appropriately with others in the workplace. They're also responsible to understand what the legislation requires of them. So once an employer has the policy and procedure in place, they need to make sure that it's accessible to all employees. And I strongly encourage all employers, when they hire new employees, to review that policy with them. So it's very important that new employees understand their responsibilities as well.
In your own experience, have you found that most employers are going through the process of review with the new hires?
Absolutely. I have found that the compliance with the legislation is there with respect to policy and procedure. Probably areas that are more difficult are monitoring or ensuring that ongoing communication and relationship management is appropriate. How people communicate and relate to each other, that can easily move from a healthy, respectful relationship into one that isn't that way. So that's something that has to be looked at on an ongoing basis. I think, though, one thing that I have found is if you ensure that people are aware of their responsibilities and their rights, and if you have supervisors and managers that are appropriately trained, then they will build a trusting relationship with employees, and employees who feel bullied and harassed they're more apt to come forward to their supervisor and manager saying, I'm having a difficult time. So hopefully with that kind of environment, you catch situations when they're maybe minimal or just starting. I guess a good example, Katherine, would be a situation where somebody might be teasing someone in the workplace, only it goes too far. So you need to be able to have the employee come forward and say, I'm just not comfortable. So dealing with those situations at a very early stage before they move into a situation that's really more of a harassing nature is something that supervisors and managers need to really be aware of.
So what happens if the employee brings a complaint forward to their immediate supervisor and it stops with that immediate supervisor? They don't take corrective action right away, or maybe they respond, oh, you know, they're just teasing, lighten up, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. What happens then for that employee?
Well, I mean, most organizations have policies and procedures that require employees to comply with the chain of command. So first I go to my immediate supervisor. But I would say that if you're not getting any action, then go to the supervisor's manager. So you may have to move up the chain of command and go to someone higher in the organization. I do believe that one of the reasons why the change to the legislation was such that the Ministry of Labor can mandate an investigation would be to cover off those situations where a supervisor or manager is saying, oh, it's nothing, don't let it bother you, and they're not taking the situation seriously.
So this came in with the latest legislation, the investigation aspect?
Well, no, the investigation was always there, but until 2016, the Ministry of Labor, under the law, did not have the right to appoint someone. So now with that change, if nothing's happening in the workplace and the employee feels that their concerns are not being paid attention to, they can go to the Ministry of Labor, and the Ministry of Labor will contact the employer. And if the employer refuses to take action, they will enforce it. So they have more enforcement capabilities with the amendments to the Occupational Health and Safety Act.
So important for each employee to be aware of this as well. We'll be right back. You're watching Perspective. Please stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Katherine G. McRae. This is Perspective with my guest Antoinette Blunt from Ironside Consulting on workplace violence, harassment in the workplace. Antoinette, so before the break we were talking about the responsibilities of the employee and the employer. What about the domestic violence in the workplace? Can you explain what that means and how is that addressed?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Katherine, employers are responsible to ensure the workplace is safe for employees. So there may be a situation where an employee is experiencing domestic abuse outside of the workplace, but the employer has some responsibilities there with respect to a safe workplace. So if they become aware that an employee may be a victim of domestic abuse, they have to take every reasonable precaution to ensure that that employee is not threatened in the workplace. So in other words, it may be if they have a conversation with the employee, maybe it's a spouse or a partner that they are experiencing domestic abuse from.
At home, you're
At
talking
home,
about. Okay.
the employer has a right to ban that person from coming on company property so that they're not allowed to come to the office. They can ensure that the employee, say it's a larger place of employment where the employee might be working shift work, or they get off work late at night, that someone would accompany them to their vehicle to make sure they get safely in their vehicle and home, because the parking lot is still part of the workplace environment. So that's where it comes into play. And so what becomes important there is that the employer trains their supervisors and managers in understanding what might be the signs and symptoms of an employee who might be experiencing domestic abuse. And what makes it even more important is that supervisors and managers have really good communication and relationship management skills with their employees, so that employees feel that they can go to them and they can trust them to help them and ensure that they're safe in the workplace.
What about in industry, large workplaces, manufacturing facilities? From my experience in the past, what I've seen is there's not a lot of communication going on between the supervisors and employees, other than pumping out production of whatever it is that's being made. Where does that fall into on, say, the plant floor, to the supervisor sitting in their office, to the office environment, to the production plant on the plant floor?
There are very many different situations, and how you address safe workplaces is going to change depending on the type of working environment that you have. So there has to be an overall corporate policy. There has to be overall training depending on the workplace as to what do we do to ensure our workplace is safe. There may be proactive measures, like there are some places of employment where you cannot even enter the place of employment without being buzzed in or allowed in by someone at the door. Some larger places of employment have security on site. So it really depends on the workplace. What becomes important is that you have a program in place and that everyone is appropriately trained, and it all falls back to communication and relationship management. People need to be vigilant in the workplace, like monitoring situations. But one thing that I found that is very, very important, and where things break down, is when employees don't trust their supervisors and managers. So it becomes absolutely critical to build a trusting relationship with your employees.
That's easier said than done sometimes. There's personality conflicts from the
Yes.
get-go. So what does the employee do then that doesn't trust their immediate supervisor, feels uncomfortable? Maybe there are domestic abuse issues going on at home. They don't feel safe in the workplace environment to discuss that with their immediate supervisor. What would they do? What would be the course of action?
So again, being proactive as an employer, if you are training your employees in regular training sessions, annual updates, you can talk about your responsibility as a company or an employer to keep the workplace safe, that you want to ensure that if anyone is experiencing domestic violence, that they feel there's someone in the organization they can go to. if they're afraid to come forward on their own, come to your supervisor with a colleague that you trust. So again, I've had employees say that, I don't feel comfortable going on my own. Well, maybe there's someone you work with that you'll feel better if they come. So
Just for support, to have
for
that support.
supervisors and managers, I always say if someone wants to talk to you and they want to have someone else there just to help them or give them the strength or courage to come forward, you should allow that. But you want to hear from the employee. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, that in some situations, you have to encourage employees, if you feel that you've reached a roadblock with your supervisor, then feel free to go above that person's head. There has to be...
There's always the fear, though,
Yeah.
I think that people,
Yeah.
they're going to lose their job or they're going to be blacklisted at work.
One of the things that is very important with this legislation is that employees need to understand that there is no retribution or retaliation for reporting an alleged harassment or bullying situation, as long as it's done in good faith. And I will say, and I've probably been involved in somewhere between 15 and 20 different types of workplace investigations over the past few years, and I have not seen a situation where the allegation was made in a very inappropriate or vexatious manner. I'm just angry at my supervisor and I'm going to file a complaint.
never
So I
seen
haven't
that?
seen that happen.
Okay.
What I've seen happen more often is a complaint come forward, and unfortunately there may not be enough evidence or there may not be witnesses to the event. So whether or not there's enough evidence or there are enough credible witnesses to support that, sometimes that is an issue of concern.
Okay, we need to go to break. We'll be right back. You're watching Perspective. Please stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Katherine G. McRae. You're watching Perspective with my guest Antoinette Blunt from Ironside Consulting on workplace harassment. Antoinette, just before the break, we were talking about your experience in all the investigations. You've never seen an allegation that was made falsely, but you have seen them fail in the sense that the evidence wasn't there.
Yes, and when you say fail, Katherine, I will say that I look at a broad spectrum of issues. There may not be enough evidence or enough witnesses that were present that would support an allegation that would, from a legal perspective, rise to the standard of a violation of the legislation. However, in that situation, I always look at workplace policies and procedures as well, because many places of employment have workplace policies with respect to respecting others, codes of conduct in the workplace, how you're expected to behave. So normally in that situation, if there's not enough evidence that would substantiate a legal violation, there certainly could be enough to substantiate a violation of policy. So that's something that I look at as well, not just what's required at law, but what's required in addition to that with other workplace policies and procedures.
What about social media? How does that play into it today?
Well, I have to say that where there is evidence to substantiate these allegations, probably 95% of the time the evidence comes from social media.
In what sense? What do you mean?
It could come from emails that are sent to a person that something that in the email is inappropriate. So there can be considerable amount of time that I would spend reviewing email threads, like back and forth between two parties over a period of time. Sometimes employees who feel that they're being harassed will take screenshots of text messages. If an email has been sent to them or a document, a file attached, I will ask that person to forward that to me so I can ensure that it is coming from a legitimate site. So in other words, if somebody gives me a picture, but there's no indication of where that came from, that is not necessarily evidence. But if the picture is attached to an email that's forwarded to me, and I know it was sent to them, then I can trace the source.
What about peer-to-peer, employee-to-employee? Say one employee sends the other a text that maybe doesn't deal with a specific issue at hand about the workplace or whatever it is, but gets into a personal put down, if you will.
And that can be very damaging. So when you look at bullying and harassment, it can be a single incident, but more often than not, you see a trend where there's emails or text messages back and forth between employees that get progressively worse. It may be the language, the choice of language, but it just may simply be ongoing. Like, I can't believe, as an example, I can't believe the way you presented in the meeting the other day. Like, don't you know what you're doing? You know, it was very poorly done. So it can be an ongoing put down of another person. So that's where a lot of the evidence comes from. And it can be in social media outside the workplace, and that can affect your workplace situation as well. So it could be something that's said on a Facebook site. So employees need to be aware of that, because if it's known where you work and where others work as well, then what you say on a public social media site can certainly come back to cause a problem for you in the workplace.
So at what point would the employee take action? With that one instance that maybe, you know, they weren't happy about what was said in a text message or an online platform or such, would they just go back to the person and address directly with that person, or do they go right away to the supervisor?
Yeah, well, when you're dealing with conflict between individuals, the first thing you want to try and encourage employees to do is, if somebody says something to you that you find offensive or inappropriate, try and work it out with that individual. Try and approach that person and say, you know, what you said at the meeting today, that really upset me, that hurt my feelings, I found it embarrassing. And maybe that person is not completely aware, they didn't realize how offended it appeared to that other person. So in most situations, if it's something that occurs like that, I really think two individuals should try and work it out.
That would be the first step.
That's the first step. But if
Okay.
this is on an ongoing basis, the other thing is, though, the initial situation, it could occur in a meeting where you have members of different organizations, members of the public, and it may be a situation where you're completely embarrassed in the public eye because you have a number of stakeholders of your organization present, maybe they're clients, customers. So it could be a single incident like that.
That
You know,
should be
yeah.
addressed.
I
fully.
mean, normally in relationships, if you try and work things out with an individual, you've got a better chance early on of trying to deal with that.